The library at Bellmere Hall was forbidden to her after 9 o'clock, which was precisely why Margaret Fenwick was there at midnight, barefoot on the cold floor, a single candle cupped in her hand, and a stolen novel pressed flat against her heart, as though she could smuggle its story into her blood before anyone caught her holding it. She had not meant to fall in love with the room itself, only with the books inside it. But 3 years in her aunt's house had taught her that even loving the wrong thing quietly, in the dark, where no one could see, was a kind of danger she had learned to court anyway. She did not expect to find another candle already burning at the far end of the room. She froze in the doorway, her heart lurching so hard she nearly dropped her own light, and for one long suspended moment she considered fleeing before whoever sat hidden among the shelves could turn and see her face. But it was too late. A voice, low and unhurried, spoke from the shadow between 2 towering cases of leather-bound history. "You need not run," it said. "I promise you I am considerably more afraid of being discovered here than you could possibly be." Margaret's candle trembled, throwing wild light across the spines of 100 books she was not permitted to touch. A man rose from the reading chair in the far corner, tall and dark-coated, his cravat loosened in a way no gentleman of consequence would allow himself among company, a heavy book still open in one hand, as though he had been interrupted mid-sentence and resented the intrusion only a little. "I did not know the room was occupied," she managed. "Forgive me. I will go." "Please don't," he said it too quickly, and seemed, for a moment, faintly startled by his own eagerness. "I have had a very tedious fortnight of being agreeable to people I do not particularly wish to be agreeable to, and you are the first person in this house who has looked at me as though I were an inconvenience rather than an opportunity. I find I would like that feeling to continue a little longer, if you don't mind." She did not know what to make of him. He was dressed well but plainly, without the ornamentation the other gentlemen at Bellmere Hall wore like armor, and there was something in his stillness, in the careful, measuring way he watched her, that made her feel at once entirely seen and entirely safe, which was a combination she had not encountered in a very long time. "You are a guest of my uncle's, I collect," she said, edging no closer, though she did not retreat either. "I have not had the pleasure." "Alaric Cole," he said, with a small bow that seemed, to her ear, oddly correct for a man who claimed to find company tedious. "I have come to catalogue the rarer volumes in this collection, at Lord Winslow's request. A dull occupation, but an honest one, and it affords me the great luxury of avoiding the drawing-room whenever I can manage it." "Margaret Fenwick," she said, and then, because honesty seemed to be the room's peculiar custom at this hour, she added, "I am not meant to be here either. My aunt does not approve of novels. She says they addle a woman's judgment and make her unfit for sensible marriage, so I am permitted only sermons and household accounts by daylight, and I have had to become rather resourceful after dark." Something in his face shifted at that. Not laughter, though there was warmth enough in his eyes to suggest he wanted to laugh, but something gentler, more attentive, as though she had told him something worth remembering, rather than something merely amusing. "And what is the great crime you are committing tonight?" She held up the novel, half defiant, half embarrassed. He crossed the room to see it properly, and when he read the title stamped in faded gold upon the spine, something like delight broke openly across his face for the first time since she had entered. "That is a very fine choice for a crime," he said. "I have read it 3 times myself, and I confess the ending undid me rather more than I like to admit to strangers in libraries at midnight." "You have read it?" She could not keep the surprise from her voice. Gentlemen of her acquaintance, what little acquaintance a poor relation was permitted, did not, in her experience, read novels, or if they did, they certainly did not confess to weeping over them. "I have read a great many things I am not meant to admit to enjoying," he said, and there was something underneath the light words, some private weight she could not name, that made her wonder, briefly, whether this Mr. Cole carried more behind his calm face than a fortnight's tedium among strangers. They spoke for nearly an hour that first night, in low voices that would not carry beyond the shelves, of the novel and a dozen others, of the particular ache of a story that understood grief without wallowing in it, of characters they had loved as though they were real people whose fates mattered more than the fates of half the acquaintances in their own lives. Margaret had not spoken so freely, so entirely without calculation, to anyone in longer than she could remember, and when at last the candle burned low, and she knew she must return to her room before the servants began to stir, she found herself reluctant to leave, in a way that frightened her considerably more than the thought of being caught out of bed. "Will you be here tomorrow?" she asked, and hated herself faintly for asking, for wanting an answer so much. "I rather think I will," said Alaric Cole, "provided you intend to be here also." She should have said no. She should have remembered, walking back through the dark and silent corridors of Bellmere Hall, exactly what her aunt had told her the day she arrived, 3 years before, orphaned and penniless, and entirely at the mercy of a household that had taken her in only because refusing would have looked unseemly before the neighbors. She should have remembered that a poor relation who allowed herself to be noticed by a gentleman risked everything and gained nothing, because whatever warmth passed between them in the dark of a library could never survive the daylight arithmetic of fortune and rank. But she did not remember any of it, not that night, not with the taste of a shared story still sweet on her tongue, and the strange, unfamiliar sensation of having been truly listened to still humming beneath her skin. The second night, she brought him a book of her own choosing, rather than the reverse, a slim volume of poetry her father had given her the Christmas before he died, its spine cracked from years of careful reading, and she watched with her heart in her throat as Alaric turned the pages with a gentleness that told her, more than any words could have, that he understood exactly what it cost her to share something so entirely her own. "Your father had good taste," he said, when he reached a poem she had marked with a pressed violet, long since flattened to little more than a shadow of itself between the pages. "He used to read that one to my mother, before she died bringing me into the world," Margaret said. "He told me once that grief and love were the same weather, only seen from different windows. I did not understand him then. I think I am only beginning to now." "That is a very fine thing to have been told," Alaric said quietly, "by a man who clearly loved you enough to give you something to carry after he was gone." He was silent a moment, turning the pressed violet's shadow beneath his thumb with a care that made her breath catch, and then he added, so low she nearly missed it, "I do not think anyone has ever given me anything of theirs to carry. I find I do not quite know what to do with the feeling of being trusted with it." She did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing, and let the silence between them settle into something warmer than words, and it was in that silence, more than in any of the conversation that came before or after, that she felt the first unguarded stirrings of something she did not yet dare to call by its true name. The third night brought laughter rather than confession. He attempted, with visible and endearing incompetence, to explain a piece of Greek philosophy he claimed to have once studied, and got so thoroughly tangled in his own explanation that Margaret laughed until she had to press both hands over her mouth to keep from waking the house. Alaric, far from looking wounded by her amusement, watched her laugh with an expression of such open, undisguised pleasure that she felt it land somewhere beneath her ribs and stay there, warm and unfamiliar, long after the candle had burned to nothing and she had crept back to her cold, narrow bed. By the fourth or fifth night, they had begun to arrive early, each pretending, with a transparency that fooled neither of them, that the earliness was accidental, a restless hour, a book remembered and needed at once, and each finding the other already there, already waiting, with a small private smile neither troubled to hide any longer. He asked her once, half in jest, whether she meant to become a permanent fixture of the library's furniture, given how faithfully she attended it, and she answered, more seriously than she intended, that the library was the only room in the house that had ever felt like it belonged to her rather than the reverse, and that she supposed, She had simply found, at last, someone who did not make her feel like an intruder in it. "You are not an intruder anywhere I am, Margaret," he said, and the plain certainty of it settled over her like warmth after a long, cold season, though she did not yet let herself examine too closely what that certainty might mean for either of them once the fortnight ended. There was a particular evening, not long before the storm and the stumble in the garden, when she arrived to find him asleep in his chair. The candle burned nearly to nothing beside him, a book fallen open across his chest. She stood a long moment in the doorway simply watching him, struck by how much younger and less guarded he looked in sleep. The careful composure he wore through every waking hour smoothed away into something almost boyish, almost unbearably tender to look upon. She did not wake him at once. She sat instead in her own chair, quiet as she could manage, and watched the candlelight move across his face until he stirred, some while later, and found her there, and neither of them spoke of how long she had been watching, though something had shifted between them by the time the candle finally guttered out, a tenderness neither dared name, settling quietly into the space where caution used to live. Margaret Fenwick had come to Bellmere Hall at 15, the only child of a country clergyman whose small living had died with him, leaving nothing behind but debts, and a daughter with no dowry, and no immediate family willing to claim her, except her mother's sister, Lady Prudence Winslow, who accepted the obligation with the particular resentment of a woman who believed charity should be quiet, unrewarded, and preferably invisible. Margaret had grown up in the shadow of her cousin Isabel, 3 years her junior, and dazzling in the effortless way that money and confidence together could make a girl dazzling, and she had learned, by slow and painful degrees, exactly how small a space she was permitted to occupy in her aunt's house, useful enough to manage the household accounts and oversee Isabel's education, invisible enough never to be considered a rival for anything Isabel might want. And what Isabel wanted, this season, more than she had ever wanted anything in her 18 years, was the Duke of Wexford. He was expected at Bellmere Hall within the week. The whole house had been rearranged around the fact of his coming, new gowns ordered, the good silver polished twice over, Lady Winslow's nerves stretched to a fineness that made her sharper than usual with everyone beneath her, which was to say, sharper than usual with Margaret. The Duke was said to be young, unmarried, possessed of one of the greatest fortunes in England, and, more intriguingly to the assembled mothers of the county, notoriously difficult to secure, having broken off one engagement already under circumstances no one quite dared discuss above a whisper. Lady Winslow had determined, with the singular focus of a general planning a campaign, that Isabel would succeed where other, lesser women had failed. Margaret had thought little of it beyond the extra work it created for her, until the night in the library changed the shape of everything, and she began, despite every warning she gave herself, to count the hours until she might slip away again to find Mr. Cole waiting among the shelves. He was there the next night, and the night after that, and by the end of the first week, it had become, without either of them naming it, a ritual as necessary to her as breathing. They spoke of books, always at first, but books gave way, by slow and inevitable degrees, to deeper things. Her father's death, the particular grief of losing not only a parent, but an entire life's certainty in a single season, his own mother, gone when he was young, and a father who had taught him, he said once, with a carefulness that suggested the wound was still tender, that affection given too freely was affection easily used against a man. He did not say more than that, and she did not press him, understanding instinctively that some griefs wanted patience rather than questions. "You speak as though you have been betrayed by someone you trusted," she said one night, when he had grown quiet after mentioning, obliquely, a woman he had once nearly married. "I have," he admitted. "It has made me rather poor company for anyone who wants something from me, because I have become very good at suspecting that everyone does." "I want nothing from you," she said, simply, "except your company in this room, which costs you nothing to give, and costs me a great deal to admit I want." Something in his face, in that moment, looked almost pained, as though her honesty were a gift he did not feel entirely worthy of receiving, and he reached out, the first time he had touched her at all in the whole fortnight of their acquaintance, and took her hand briefly in his, pressing it with a gentleness that made her breath catch in her throat. "You are the first person in a very long while," he said quietly, "who has made me forget to suspect anything at all." It could not last, of course, and Margaret knew it could not last, even as she let herself sink deeper into the strange, private happiness of those midnight hours. The Duke's arrival was announced for the end of the following week, and with it came a grand ball that Lady Winslow had been planning for a month, the occasion upon which she intended Isabel's future to be sealed beyond any possibility of rescue. Margaret had been given her instructions already. She would assist with the preparations, she would help dress Isabel, and she would then retire quietly to whatever corner a poor relation was expected to occupy at a ball meant to showcase everyone but herself. She did not tell Alaric Cole about the ball, not directly, though she mentioned once, in passing, how much work the household had ahead of it in preparing for a duke's visit, and watched, without understanding why, something flicker across his face, a tightness around the eyes, quickly smoothed away, that she would only later recognize as guilt. It was Isabel who noticed first, though she noticed the wrong thing entirely. "You have seemed almost happy lately," her cousin observed one morning, watching Margaret hum quietly over the household accounts in a manner that had not been her habit these 3 years. "It is a strange thing to say of you, I know, but there it is. Has something changed?" "Nothing has changed," Margaret said, too quickly, bending her head lower over the ledger to hide the color rising in her cheeks. "It had better be nothing," Isabel said, not unkindly, though there was a new watchfulness in her gaze that had not been there before. "Mamma would not be pleased if you were engaging in some private happiness just now, of all times, with the Duke's household about to descend upon us. You know how she feels about anything that might draw attention away from what matters this season." Margaret said nothing, because there was nothing safe to say, and the warning, however carelessly delivered, settled into her stomach like a stone that did not fully dissolve for the rest of the day. She resolved, that night, to be more careful, to keep the library conversations shorter, the confidences smaller, the dangerous, unguarded warmth she felt in Alaric's company tucked more firmly out of sight. Her resolve lasted exactly as long as it took her to see him waiting for her among the shelves the following evening, his whole face changing, softening, the instant he caught sight of her in the doorway, as though she were the answer to a question he had been quietly asking for a very long time without knowing it, and every careful intention she had built through the day dissolved at once into the simple, undefended relief of being wanted. There was a night, not long after, when a sudden storm sent her hurrying through the dark garden path back toward the house after a stolen hour walking beneath the stars with him, and she caught her slipper on a root and stumbled hard enough to cry out. Alaric caught her before she fell, one arm closing around her waist with a speed and a strength that startled them both, and for a long moment neither of them moved, her hand fisted in the front of his coat, his breath unsteady against her hair, the rain beginning to patter cold against the leaves above them. "Are you hurt?" he asked, low and rough, his hand cradling the back of her head as though she was something infinitely fragile and infinitely precious at once. "No," she managed, only startled. He did not release her at once, and she did not ask him to. "I find," he said quietly, into the small space between them, "that I am becoming rather less careful about you than I ought to be, Margaret Fenwick. I do not entirely know what to do about that." "Perhaps," she said, her heart hammering, "you are not meant to do anything about it at all." He walked her the rest of the way to the house in silence after that, his hand light and warm at the small of her back, and neither of them spoke of the moment again, though it lived on between them afterward, in every glance, every held breath, every night that followed in the library, where the space between their two chairs seemed, somehow, to have grown smaller without either of them moving the furniture. There were signs in that final week that a less trusting heart might have read more carefully. She noticed that the housekeeper addressed Mr. Cole with a deference that seemed disproportionate to a hired cataloguer of books. She noticed that Lord Winslow himself, passing through the library one afternoon, had bowed to Mr. Cole with a depth that struck her, in the moment, as merely eccentric courtesy between gentlemen. She noticed, too, that Mr. Cole's hands, for all his claimed occupation among dusty volumes, bore none of the ink stains or paper cuts she associated with genuine scholarly labor. She noticed all of it and set it aside, each time, with the same quiet refusal that had carried her through 3 years of swallowed disappointment. It is not my place to wonder. Whatever he is, he has been kind to me, and I have had so little kindness that I cannot afford to question the shape it comes in. It was 4 nights before the ball that the confession nearly came. They sat, as they always did, in the 2 worn chairs by the cold hearth, a single candle burning low between them, and Alaric had grown unusually quiet, turning a small, leather-bound volume over and over in his hands without opening it. "Margaret," he said at last, and something in his voice made her set down her own book entirely, every part of her suddenly sharply attentive. "There is something I have not told you about myself. I have wanted to tell you every night since the first, and every night I have found some reason to delay it, and I am ashamed to say the reason has grown less honorable each time. I must tell you now, before the ball, before—" The library door opened without warning, spilling candlelight and Lady Winslow's sharp, carrying voice into the room before either of them could compose themselves. "Margaret, what in heaven's name are you doing out of your bed at this hour, and in company no less?" Margaret shot to her feet so quickly her book tumbled to the floor. Her aunt stood in the doorway in her dressing gown, a chamber candle in one hand, her face contorting through surprise into something colder and far more dangerous as she took in the scene. Her niece, barefoot and dishevelled, alone in a darkened room, with a man she did not immediately recognize. "Lady Winslow," Alaric rose as well, with far more composure than the moment seemed to warrant, though Margaret noticed his jaw had tightened in a way that suggested the composure cost him something. "I fear the fault is entirely mine. I could not sleep, and came to continue my work among the volumes, and Miss Fenwick was kind enough to assist me in locating—" "I am not interested in your explanations, Mr. Cole." Lady Winslow's voice had gone glacial, though it did not rise. "I am interested in my niece's reputation, which cannot survive being found alone with a gentleman at midnight, whatever the innocent excuse offered for it. Margaret, you will go to your room this instant, and we will discuss, in the morning, precisely what is to be done about your conduct." Margaret went, because there was nothing else to do, her face burning with a humiliation so total it left no room for the questions crowding behind it. What had he meant to tell her, and why had her aunt's fury felt, beneath its coldness, like something closer to fear than mere propriety? She did not sleep. She lay awake through the small hours, turning over every word he had said, every unfinished sentence, and it was not until nearly dawn that she understood, with a slow and sinking dread, precisely what her aunt intended to do about a niece who had embarrassed the household on the very eve of a duke's arrival. The morning brought no discussion, only decree. Margaret was summoned to her aunt's dressing room and informed, in tones that permitted no argument, that her behaviour had confirmed what Lady Winslow had long suspected, that Margaret's presence in the household was a liability that had finally outgrown its usefulness. A Mr. Josiah Pratt, a widowed merchant of considerable means but coarse manner, well known in the county for having buried one wife already, under circumstances no one troubled to investigate too closely, had made inquiries some months prior about a wife willing to manage his household and ask no questions about his business. Lady Winslow had, until now, considered the match beneath even a poor relation's consideration. She no longer considered it beneath anything at all. "You will meet him at the ball," Lady Winslow said, not looking up from her mirror. "You will be civil, and you will be grateful, and you will not shame this family with any further midnight foolishness. I have written already to accept his interest on your behalf. The arrangement will be settled before the month is out." Margaret stood very still, the floor seeming to tilt beneath her feet, and thought, with a clarity that frightened her, that she had exchanged one form of invisibility for another, far worse, not merely unseen now, but actively disposed of, sold into a marriage she had never once been asked to consent to, because the alternative was a family too proud to admit that a poor relation's happiness had ever mattered to them at all. "Aunt, please." The words came out of her before she could stop them, raw and unguarded, in a way she had trained herself never to be in this room. "I have managed your household faithfully for 3 years. I have asked for nothing beyond my keep. I am asking you now, I am asking you for the first time in all these years, not to do this." Lady Winslow set down her hairbrush with a precision that was somehow more frightening than any raised voice could have been. "You are asking me," she said, "to disregard the good sense of a match that will settle your future, secure your comfort, and remove a considerable expense from a household that has borne it without complaint for 3 years, on the strength of what? A girl's midnight fancy for a man who was, until yesterday, no one at all. You forget yourself, Margaret. I did not ask what you wanted when I took you in as a penniless orphan, and I do not intend to begin asking now, when the asking would cost this family a settled and respectable arrangement in favor of some romantic foolishness that will not survive its first winter." There was nothing more to say. Margaret curtsied, because 3 years of training did not abandon her even in the wreckage of her own future, and left the room with her spine held rigid and her eyes dry, saving the tears for the privacy of her own narrow bed, where she wept until there was nothing left to weep with, for a father who would never have permitted such a bargain, for a mother she had never known, and for a fortnight of stolen happiness she had already begun, in the cold logic of her aunt's decree, to mourn as a thing irretrievably lost. She did not see Alaric Cole for 2 full days after that. She told herself it was a mercy, that whatever he had meant to confess in the library could only complicate a situation already beyond repair, and she almost believed it, except that every hour without him felt like a small, private grief added to the larger one already crushing her chest. It was Isabel, of all people, who inadvertently gave her the truth. "You will never guess," her cousin said breathlessly, bursting into the room where Margaret sat mending a torn hem 2 nights before the ball, "what Mama has just learned from Lord Ashby's man, the scholar Papa hired to catalogue the library, Mr. Cole. He is not a scholar at all. He is the Duke of Wexford himself, come early and in disguise, to observe the household before committing himself to any formal courtship. Can you imagine such a thing? He has been living under our very roof this fortnight, and none of us had the least idea." The mending fell from Margaret's hands. For one long, suspended moment, the room seemed to tilt entirely on its axis, every conversation of the past fortnight rearranging itself in her memory with a terrible new clarity. The housekeeper's deference, Lord Winslow's excessive bow, the hands too smooth for honest labor, and beneath all of it, the unfinished confession he had tried 3 times to make, and 3 times been prevented from completing. "Mama is beside herself," Isabel went on, oblivious to the way the color had drained entirely from her cousin's face. "She says it changes nothing about our plans for the ball, only that we must be doubly careful now to make the right impression, since he has clearly been testing everyone's true character this whole while. I wonder what he has observed of us. I do hope I have not said anything foolish in his hearing." Margaret said nothing at all. She could not. The betrayal of it settled over her like ice water. Not merely that he had lied about his name, but that he had let her speak of her grief, her father, her small private hopes, with the full and deliberate knowledge that she had no idea she was confiding in one of the most powerful men in England. Every tender word, every shared confidence, every moment she had treasured as proof that someone, finally, saw her as more than a pair of useful hands. All of it had happened while he watched her, weighed her, tested her, as though she were a specimen and not a person entitled to know the true stakes of her own honesty. She did not go to the library that night, nor the next. She told herself she would not go again at all. Alaric Ravensworth, 9th Duke of Wexford, had entered Bellmere Hall 3 weeks prior with a single, carefully guarded purpose: to determine, before he ever pledged himself to marry again, whether any woman could care for him without knowing what his name might purchase her. The wound beneath that purpose ran deeper than he had ever confessed to anyone outside his own family. 2 years before, he had been engaged to a viscount's daughter renowned for her warmth and wit, only to discover, through the cruel accident of an intercepted letter, that she had confided to her closest friend a detailed accounting of exactly what his title and fortune would allow her to purchase, with scarcely a mention of the man himself beyond his general tolerability as a husband. He had broken the engagement quietly, at considerable cost to his own reputation, and had come away from the wreckage with a conviction he could not shake, that flattery and warmth, in a woman's mouth, meant nothing at all until tested against the possibility that she believed there was nothing to be gained from offering either. His steward had suggested the disguise, half in jest, when the invitation to Bellmere Hall arrived alongside a dozen others that season, each house eager to present its most eligible daughter for his consideration. Lord Winslow, an old family friend, had been the only host willing to indulge so eccentric a scheme, agreeing readily enough to present the Duke's arrival as delayed by a week, while a quiet scholar calling himself Mr. Cole took up residence to catalogue a library everyone at Bellmere Hall had long neglected. Alaric had expected the household to yield exactly what every household had yielded before: calculation dressed as charm, warmth that could be measured precisely against whatever advantage it hoped to purchase. He had not expected Margaret Fenwick, barefoot and startled, a stolen novel pressed to her chest like a confession. He had watched her, that first week, with the same wary, clinical distance he brought to every young woman paraded before him, waiting for the flattery to surface, the careful angling toward his supposed occupation and connections. It never came. She spoke to him of grief and books and small, unguarded hopes, with an honesty that seemed to cost her something each time she offered it, and he found himself, against every careful defense he had built over 2 years, wanting to know more of her rather than less, wanting, for the first time since the wreckage of his broken engagement, to be known himself, rather than merely observed and assessed. He had meant to tell her the truth within the first week. He had told himself, each night he failed to do it, that the delay cost nothing, that there would be time enough before the ball, before circumstances forced the matter, regardless of his own courage. He had not accounted for Lady Winslow's midnight interruption, nor for the swiftness with which a household's gossip could outrun his own careful intentions, and when word reached him, through his own valet, mortified to have let the secret slip below stairs, that the whole of Bellmere Hall now knew precisely who Mr. Cole truly was, he understood, with a dread that settled cold and heavy in his chest, that Margaret would learn the truth not from his own mouth, as he had promised himself she would, but from servants' gossip and a cousin's careless excitement, exactly the manner of revelation most likely to convince her that every tender word between them had been calculated deception rather than the truest thing he had said to anyone in 2 years. He was right to dread it. When he found her at last, 2 days before the ball, in the walled garden where she had gone to escape the house's frantic preparations, her face was composed into a careful, distant courtesy that frightened him considerably more than open fury would have done. "Your Grace," she said, and the title landed between them like a wall thrown up in an instant, complete and unyielding. "I understand congratulations are in order, though I confess I do not know precisely what for. Successfully deceiving a household for a fortnight, perhaps." "Margaret. Miss Fenwick," she corrected, and something in the careful precision of it hurt him more than a raised voice could have. "I think that is the correct form of address now, is it not? Between a duke and a poor relation," he amused himself observing. You were never an amusement to me." He took a step toward her, stopped himself when she stiffened, and stood instead with his hands loose and open at his sides, as though offering proof he meant no further harm. "I know you cannot believe that easily. Not now, but it is the truth, and I would rather you be angry at the truth than comforted by a lie." "How am I to know the difference?" Her voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word, and she hated herself for it, hated that even now, wounded and furious, some part of her still wanted desperately to believe him. "You are very skilled, Your Grace, at knowing precisely what to say. I imagine it is a useful skill in a man who spends his life being courted for reasons that have nothing to do with his character. How am I to know I am not simply hearing more of the same skill now, aimed at softening a scandal rather than winning a bride?" "You cannot know," he admitted, and the honesty of it seemed to cost him something visible. A flinch he did not trouble to hide. "I cannot prove it to you with words. Not today. Perhaps not for a long while yet. I can only tell you that I have spent this whole fortnight forgetting, for the first time in 2 years, to calculate anything at all, and that the forgetting frightened me considerably more than any flattery I have ever been offered, because it meant I had stopped protecting myself, and I did not know how to tell you that without also telling you everything else I had been hiding. I did not amuse myself," he said, and the roughness in his voice was entirely unfeigned. "I have never in 2 years spoken to anyone as honestly as I have spoken to you in that library, and I did not lie to you about anything that mattered, only my name, and I withheld it because I have been burned badly enough by flattery that I could not risk being flattered again before I knew, beyond any doubt, that what passed between us was real." "And was it not equally cruel," she said, her composure cracking at last, "to let me believe I was speaking to someone as unremarkable and unprotected as myself, when in truth you held every advantage and I held none? You risked nothing in our honesty, Your Grace. I risked everything. I told you things I have told no one since my father died, and I told them to a man I believed had no power to use them against me, only to learn that the very opposite was true the entire time." He had no answer for that, because it was true, and he knew it was true, and the knowledge of it sat like a stone in his chest as she turned and walked back toward the house, leaving him alone among the roses, with the bitter understanding that whatever he had hoped to prove by his disguise, he had proven it at a cost he had never properly weighed until now, the cost of her trust, which he had taken without her knowledge and could not simply hand back by revealing his name. Frederick Ashby, an old friend from his university days who had accompanied him to Bellmere Hall under no disguise at all and had watched the whole affair unfold with a mixture of amusement and growing concern, found him that same evening standing alone at his window, a full glass of brandy untouched on the sill beside him. "You look," Frederick observed, "like a man who has just discovered that winning is not the same as being right." "I do not know how to undo it," Alaric said, without turning. "I cannot make her unknow what I withheld from her. I cannot make the fortnight begin again with honesty from the first night instead of the last. I have spent 2 years guarding myself so carefully against being wanted for the wrong reasons that I never once considered what it would cost the one person who wanted me for the right ones." "Then stop trying to undo it," Frederick said, "and start proving, instead, that you are worth the trouble of forgiving. She does not need the fortnight rewritten, Alaric. She needs to see, going forward, that the man in that library and the Duke at that ball are the same man, behaving the same way, whether anyone is watching him or not." Alaric turned the words over through the long, sleepless hours that followed, and by the time dawn broke grey and reluctant over Bellmere Hall's gardens, he had resolved that whatever happened at the ball, whatever Lady Winslow's schemes, whatever cruelty circumstance forced into his path, he would not spend another hour deciding things on Margaret's behalf without her knowledge. It was a resolution he came dangerously close to breaking within the very first hour of the ball itself, the moment he saw Josiah Pratt's hand close around her wrist. The ball arrived regardless of the wreckage between them, as balls always did, indifferent to private grief. Bellmere Hall blazed with candlelight from every window, every family of consequence in the county assembled to witness what everyone now understood, with the household's secret finally and thoroughly public, to be the true unveiling of the Duke of Wexford before society. Lady Winslow had redoubled her efforts upon Isabel with the ferocity of a general who had lost precious days to an unexpected complication, and Margaret had been given her own instructions with a coldness that left no room for argument. She would attend. She would be introduced that very evening to Mr. Josiah Pratt, and she would conduct herself, whatever her private feelings, in a manner that reflected credit upon the family that had, however grudgingly, kept her from the poorhouse these 3 years. She stood near the edge of the ballroom, in a gown 2 seasons out of fashion, mended so carefully at the hem that only she knew where the tear had been, and watched Mr. Pratt approach her with an expression of proprietary satisfaction that made her skin crawl before he had spoken a single word. He was heavier than she had imagined, red-faced from the heat of the room and the wine already taken, and his eyes moved over her with the frank, assessing coldness of a man inspecting livestock rather than a woman he intended to marry. "Miss Fenwick," he said, taking her hand without asking leave to do so, his grip too tight, too familiar. "I am told we are to be very well acquainted indeed before the month is out. I confess, I like what I see. You'll do." She wanted, in that moment, to be anywhere else in England, anywhere at all, rather than trapped in a ballroom, being appraised like a parcel of goods by a man who had buried 1 wife already and clearly intended his second to give him no more trouble than the first had, in the end. She looked, despite every resolution she had made, across the crowded room toward the small knot of guests surrounding the Duke of Wexford, and found, to her own furious embarrassment, that his eyes were already fixed on her, on Mr. Pratt's hand still closed around her own, with an expression of such controlled, thunderous fury that the gentleman nearest him took an involuntary step backward. Alaric crossed the ballroom before he had entirely decided to do so, his long stride cutting through clusters of startled guests with a directness that silenced the nearest conversations one by one, until a hush had begun to spread outward from his path, like ripples from a stone, dropped into still water. "Mr. Pratt," he said, and though his voice was quiet, it carried with the particular authority of a man who has never once in his life needed to raise it to be obeyed. "I believe you are laboring under a misapprehension regarding Miss Fenwick's availability." Mr. Pratt released her hand as though it had scolded him, bowing so low and so suddenly that he nearly overbalanced. "Your Grace, I had no notion. That is, Lady Winslow gave me to understand." "Lady Winslow was mistaken," Alaric said, "and I would advise you, sir, to seek your household comforts elsewhere. I understand you have some experience in the matter of wives who do not survive your particular attentions. I would not wish to see a third." The words fell into the silent ballroom like a blade, and Mr. Pratt, his face gone the colour of old suet, made his excuses, and did not, Margaret would later learn, remain another hour beneath Bellmere Hall's roof. But it was not relief she felt, standing frozen at the centre of every eye in the room, only a fresh and blistering humiliation, the sense of being rescued as one rescues a possession, rather than consulted as one consults a person. "I did not ask for your protection, Your Grace," she said, low and fierce, before he could speak again. "I have managed 3 years of this family's indifference without your interference, and I do not intend to trade one man's ownership of me for another's, however finely you dress the exchange." Something in his face, at that, changed entirely, the controlled fury dissolving into something rawer, more uncertain, the look of a man realizing, too late, that his grand gesture had wounded exactly where he had meant to heal. "You are right," he said, quietly enough that only she could hear it, though every eye in the hall remained fixed upon them. "I have done it again, haven't I? I have acted upon your behalf, instead of asking what you wished, exactly as I withheld my name, instead of trusting you to choose what to do with the truth of it. I am sorry, Margaret. I did not come across this ballroom to claim you. I came to stop a cruelty I could not stand by and watch, and I have clearly gone about even that too clumsily to spare your dignity in the doing of it. Tell me what you wish, and I will do that instead, whatever it costs me." Somewhere behind her, Margaret was dimly aware of Lady Winslow's face, gone the colour of ash, of Isabel's hand pressed to her own mouth, of 100 whispered speculations already forming themselves into the shape of tomorrow's gossip. None of it, in that moment, mattered half so much as the man standing before her, with his pride laid open for the whole county to examine, asking, for what she suspected was the first time in his adult life, not what a room expected of him, but what she herself required. The whole ballroom waited, breathless, scandalized, fascinated, as Margaret Fenwick stood before the Duke of Wexford in her twice-mended gown and considered, for a long moment, exactly what she wished to say. "I wish," she said at last, her voice steadier than she felt, "for the truth, spoken plainly, without disguise and without rescue, dressed up as romance. Did you care for me, Your Grace, or did you care for the experiment of being unknown? Because I have spent 3 years being managed by people who decided what was best for me without troubling to ask, and I find I would rather remain unmarried and unmanaged for the rest of my life than exchange my aunt's ownership for yours, however much kinder your intentions." "I care for you," he said, and there was nothing performed in it now, nothing calculated for the watching crowd, only a rough, unguarded honesty that seemed to cost him everything to give in so public a room. Not the disguise, not the experiment. You, Margaret Fenwick, who spoke to me of grief and books and midnight courage before you knew there was anything to be gained by doing so. I have loved exactly one honest thing in 2 years of being courted for my name, and it was you, in a library, at midnight, with a stolen novel pressed against your heart. I do not ask you to marry a duke. I am asking whether you might, in time, forgive a man who was so afraid of being wanted for the wrong reasons that he nearly lost the only woman who ever wanted him for the right ones." The silence that followed was absolute, the whole glittering assembly holding its breath as one, and Margaret felt something long held rigid within her chest begin, slowly and painfully, to loosen. "I will not answer you tonight," she said, and watched something flicker of fear cross his face before she continued, gently now, "because I think we have both spent this fortnight discovering things about honesty that neither of us has fully learned yet, and I would rather build whatever comes next on truth, given time to prove itself, than on a declaration made before an audience, however finely spoken. But I will tell you this, Your Grace, before witnesses enough to hold you to it. You may find me in the library tomorrow night, if you wish to continue the conversation you began 3 weeks ago and never finished. I believe you owe me the end of a sentence." A ripple of astonished, delighted laughter moved through the nearest guests, breaking the terrible tension of the room, and Alaric Ravensworth, Duke of Wexford, bowed to her with a depth and a sincerity that owed nothing to rank and everything to the plain, unguarded gratitude of a man who understood he had been given exactly the chance he did not deserve and meant, entirely, to earn it. He was in the library the following night, as she had known, with some fragile and disbelieving hope that he would be, and this time, when he began the sentence he had left unfinished 3 weeks before, nothing interrupted him before the end of it. "I meant to tell you," he said, "that I had never once, in 2 years of careful suspicion, expected to find someone whose honesty made me forget to guard my own. I meant to tell you that, whatever came of the ball, of my name, of everything my title might complicate between us, I did not want to lose the nights we had spent in these 2 chairs, because they were the truest thing I had known since before my mother died. That is the sentence, Margaret. I am sorry it took a scandal and a ballroom to let me finish it." She did not answer him at once with words. She crossed the small space between the 2 worn chairs and took the book from his hands and set it gently aside and told him, in the quiet, unhurried honesty she had once believed too dangerous to offer anyone, that she had missed him more in 2 days of silence than she had missed anything in 3 years of careful, guarded survival, and that she thought, given time enough to trust the shape of it, she might be persuaded to forgive a duke who had first loved her as an ordinary man. Lady Winslow, faced with the impossibility of opposing a duke's declared intentions before half the county, discovered a sudden and remarkable enthusiasm for the match she had so recently dismissed as unthinkable, though her transparent reversal earned her little credit with anyone who had witnessed the ballroom scene, least of all her own daughter. She attempted, in the days that followed, to install herself at the center of the courtship's every arrangement, speaking of "my niece, soon to be a duchess," to anyone within earshot, with a proprietary warmth that would have been laughable had it not been so plainly self-serving, and it was Alaric himself, with quiet and immovable courtesy, who informed her that Margaret's happiness had been arranged without her ladyship's assistance, and would continue to be conducted the same way. Lady Winslow did not trouble the library again. Isabel, to her considerable credit, proved more gracious than her mother, confessing to Margaret privately, over tea taken in the same garden where the confrontation had first soured between them, that she had never truly wanted a husband who looked at her the way the Duke had always looked at her cousin, as though she were the only interesting thing in any room he entered, and that she had spent the whole fortnight secretly relieved not to be the object of so exacting and thorough a study. "I should have found it exhausting, being seen so completely," Isabel admitted, with a rueful honesty that surprised them both. "I think I would rather be admired a little, and understood not at all. You were always better suited to being known, Margaret, even when none of us troubled to notice." The strained distance between them softened, in the months that followed, into something closer to genuine affection than either had known in years of enforced comparison, and it was Isabel, in the end, who stood nearest Margaret at the altar the following spring, weeping with an unguarded joy that owed nothing to performance. Mr. Josiah Pratt, for his part, quit the county entirely within a fortnight of the ball, his prospects among the local families having withered considerably once the Duke's public warning made its inevitable way through every drawing-room between Bellmere Hall and the county town. Margaret felt, on hearing of his departure, not triumph exactly, but a quiet, settling relief, the particular relief of a door closed firmly upon a future she had been given no choice in facing, now permanently barred against her. Word of the ballroom scene travelled, as such things always did, well beyond the borders of the county, and Margaret found herself, in the weeks that followed, an object of curiosity she had never once experienced in 3 years of careful invisibility. Ladies who had never troubled to learn her name now sought her out at every gathering, eager to hear some first-hand account of the night a duke had defended a poor relation before half the ton, and Margaret, who had spent so long being unseen that she scarcely knew how to be seen with grace, found the attention almost stranger to bear than the neglect had ever been. It was Alaric, in the end, who taught her how to hold it lightly, how to answer a prying question with warmth rather than defensiveness, how to let curiosity pass through a room without letting it settle into her chest and take up permanent residence there, the way her aunt's coldness once had. The courtship that followed the ball moved slowly and deliberately, by Margaret's own insistence, built night by night, in the same 2 chairs where it had first begun. Alaric came to understand, in those unhurried weeks, precisely what his disguise had cost her. Not merely a fortnight's innocence about his rank, but the deeper, more lasting fear that anyone who claimed to love her plainly might yet be measuring her worth against some hidden ledger she was not permitted to see. He set himself, with the same careful attention he had once brought to cataloguing rare volumes, to proving otherwise. He asked her opinion before acting on her behalf, in matters large and small, until the habit of consulting her became as natural to him as breathing. He brought her, one grey afternoon, a small collection of pressed violets gathered from the very garden where they had quarrelled, framed simply and without ornament, a quiet echo of the flower she had once shown him between the pages of her father's poetry. And when at last he asked her, formally and without any audience but the two of them and the dying candle between them, whether she would consent to be his wife, he asked it as a question she was entirely free to answer either way, and waited, without a single word of persuasion, for her to find her own answer in her own time. "I have spent 3 years being told what I would do, and only 3 weeks being asked what I wished," she told him, when her answer finally came. "I find I like being asked considerably better, and I find, having been asked, that what I wish is you, not the disguise, and not the Duke, but the man who read poetry to a stranger in the dark, because he did not yet know how badly he needed to be known." When at last she consented to marry him, the following spring, in a small chapel wedding that traded the ballroom spectacle for something quieter and infinitely more real, she carried, tucked beneath her bouquet, the same worn novel that had first brought her, barefoot and startled, into a library where a duke in disguise had been waiting, without either of them knowing it yet, for exactly her. Only a handful of guests attended, Isabel weeping openly in the front pew, Frederick Ashby standing witness with an expression of profound and unashamed relief that his friend's long guardedness had finally found its match, and, seated quietly near the back, several of the household servants from Bellmere Hall, who had known Margaret longest and loved her best, and who Alaric had insisted, over Lady Winslow's faint protests, be given a proper place among the invited, rather than left to watch from some distant doorway, as poor relations and servants alike had so often been made to do before. Alaric had asked the local bookbinder to rebind its cracked spine in fine leather as a wedding gift, and had inscribed the inside cover himself, in a hand she recognized instantly from 3 weeks of shared marginalia, to the only reader who ever made me forget I was being watched. She kept that library, in all the grand houses that became hers afterward, as the one room in every house she never allowed anyone to rearrange, and she never lit a single candle there, in all the years that followed, without remembering the night she had crept in barefoot to steal a story, and found, instead, the truest one of her life already waiting among the shelves, patient and unguarded, exactly where love had been sitting all along.